This week we're going to cover the immune system, and the immune system is one of the reasons why you are here. Without a functioning immune system, you'd be the boy in the bubble, right? And boy in the bubble has a finite lifespan, correct? Until they can undergo a bone marrow transplant, which will then give them the cells that we actually talked about that were part of the bone marrow, the B cells and the T cells. So we've actually already touched that, and we're going to get into more detail on lymphocytes and how they help us with an immunity or immune system function. But first off, let's go ahead and cover the two main systems or ways we are protected from the nasties in our environment. We have an innate or non-specific defense, which is what we were born with. So it's built in, it's part of our construction, part of our actual physical or anatomical design. And then we have the adaptive, also called specific defense in some of the other books and literatures and exams. And that is something that has to be acquired. So it's not part of what we were actually naturally born with. The mechanisms are there, but the actual ability to save you is not there until certain steps are achieved. So let's take a look at the innate one first when we talk about influenza. And we're also going to talk about the acquired one also for influenza. So let's take a look at influenza and see what our body does to protect us from the invasion of influenza. And right off the bat, the invasion of influenza, how are you protected from influenza getting into you? Your skin. So when because you know what, most of us do know what influenza is. It is a virus. It is transmitted in respiratory particles or saliva, things along that line. Coughing, sneezing, drinking after somebody else is a surefire way to actually have the exposure to influenza. But if you have the exposure to influenza and you have proper surface barriers, your chances are actually going to be pretty good that you're going to be protected. So coughing on your skin won't give you influenza, correct? Because it is a virus. And what is so nice about our skin is a covering or a mantle that sloughs off every day, correct? So our surface layers slough off, so we don't have to worry about invasion via that. But what about our mucosa or mucous membranes? Don't we have our eyes? If somebody sneezes at you and you don't close your eyes in time, that little virus got bulleted into your eyes. What about your nasal mucosa or your oral mucosa? That little virus that was actually put out into little projectile missiles is coming at you. And so you actually have certain surface barriers besides the skin, because the skin is unique, that the mucosa will have to protect you against the surface barrier penetration by these pathogens. And pathogen is any disease-causing microorganism. So realize we have a beautiful innate immunity or protection that's part of our construction or design, and that's going to protect us beautifully from influenza. But also, if anybody gets influenza, they get, and they have not had it before, they get really, really sick. They get a high fever, which is also, is that specific or a non-specific way to protect you? It's a non-specific mechanism. So that's also the innate mechanism there. So there's lots of different ways we are constructed to kind of ward off offending agents, so to speak. Now, if they get into the system, if they breach our innate barriers or mechanisms that we have to protect us, then we need another line of defense. And so that's where our acquired or adaptive or specific defense comes into play. And that's why whenever it's flu season, you hear all over the news, you need to go in and get a flu shot, because the flu shot is an early warning system. With the flu shot, you're injected with specific particles of the virus so the virus is not whole, it can't make you sick. You can still have a reaction to the shot, just like any foreign material that's put into your body, but the virus is not whole. But the bad parts of the virus have been broken up and put into your system so that it can then be taken to the areas of immune surveillance, which remember are areas where we find a lot of lymphocytes. and present them to our lymphocytes, and then our lymphocytes will go, oh, hey, this is bad news, and let's go ahead and get ready to fight this. And so we turn on this system in a very stepwise fashion. And I don't know if you know anything about administration. So this is the administrators. Administrators are they quick to respond to a need or slow to respond to a need? Slow to respond to a need. And so what will happen is you'll get an immune response with the first exposure, but it will be slow. But then after the first exposure, which we'll talk about when we get into our adaptive system, then you will actually have a more rapid response because you have more of the actual, what I call, supportive personnel already in place to actually start fighting the offending agent. So the flu shot is an early warning system. It's there to prime your immune system so that when you actually are exposed to the virus, it says, already seen it, already know what to do about it, and I'm going to do it now because I've already been given my orders previously. I don't need to get them again. So that's what's really nice about the flu shot. That's why I call it an early warning system. Gets your system ready for the actual attack. The problem with vaccines, though, are they always 100% effective? No. And so that's always a problem that we have to realize. And so a lot of people will say the vaccine didn't work for me, and they may be absolutely right, because not all vaccines are 100% effective on each individual. And so that variability of actually mounting an immune response is why we end up with booster shots or a series of shots, because the first shot is not guaranteed to actually provide you with immunity. So influenza, surface barriers, and fever are excellent examples of an innate way to protect ourselves from that. But from the adaptive or the acquired one, we will do a vaccine. And a vaccine is also called an immunization for a very important reason, because it turns on the immune system. Looking at our a flow chart here of innate immunity, skin and mucosal membranes preventing injury, non-specific internal defenses, and so it shows you that we actually have a cellular component that's non-specific. It will react this way to whatever it encounters. There are chemicals that we actually have in our system that protect us from things that are also not designed for a specific type of thing other than if it's a virus or bacteria. And then the physiological responses of inflammation and fever come about because of various chemicals released at the site of damage. When we get into adaptive, which will be next time we get together, we'll talk about B lymphocytes first and then T lymphocytes, or T cells and B cells. So innate defenses, disease resistance is automatic. It is built in. Pathogen, a disease-causing microorganism. So we think of viruses, we think of bacteria, we even think of fungal things, fungal infections causing these problems. Anything that can cause an infection would also be something that I would relate to as a pathogen. Surface barriers is indeed the very first line of defense. Skin and mucous membranes will prevent entry of the pathogen. Physically, our skin has many layers of cells. So when you see there are many layers of cells, realize that skin and a little bit in the oral mucosa, because we also have many layers of cells there also. So that's one of the nice things that we get from the surface barrier, our skin and mucous membranes. But then we also get some other help from these surface linings. Chemically, once you get into the stomach, so you ingest a pathogen, once it gets into the stomach, we're going to douse it with acid, pH of 2 in the stomach, pretty acidic environment. So that's great in preventing growth of microorganisms. However, what we have on our skin, our sweat and our sebaceous secretions are also acidic, so that will inhibit growth, but our stomach will do a better job of actually bombarding any pathogen once it gets into the stomach contents because of HCl, which stands for hydrochloric acid. There are also enzymes in the stomach that are designed to digest proteins. We'll get into that in more detail when we get into the digestive chapter. Other chemical barriers besides acid, we actually have enzymes, and these are really important. These are surface structures with enzymes designed to destroy bacteria. And remember, we have exposed conjunctiva and things along that line. That's a mucous membrane also. And we have lysozyme that's in the lacrimal secretions as well as in our own saliva. So we have some digestive enzymes even in the oral cavity that are going to help to break down bacteria and other particles that get in. Mucin, sticky mucus, traps microorganisms, very prevalent in your lungs, but you have some in your GI tract also. Defensins, these are chemicals that act like broad-spectrum antimicrobials. So these are proteins, chemicals acting like broad-spectrum antimicrobials, and they are secreted in a small amount when things are normal. However, when inflammation occurs, defensins levels increases. So increased defensin concentration or emission. So inflammation will help to increase defensin concentration, which is basically, I liken defensins as a knife. So defensins, a knife is non-specific, right? It doesn't matter who you apply it to, it will cause damage. And so defensins are these antimicrobial proteins that will actually start stabbing away at the pathogen and destroying it. In that fashion, when you have more knives that you bring to the party, you'll have more damage and destruction to the offending agent. Now we've made it past the surface barriers. We are now into the CT below the surface barrier, so we're into the dermis and even the subdermal areas from our skin or into the CT of our mucosa. So now we need to bring in the next layer. So this is second line of defense is still our innate mechanism, and this is going to involve cells and various chemicals. So cellularly, we're going to start off with our phagocytes, found right under the epidermis of the skin, in the dermis, and even deeper tissues, as well as in the CT of the mucous membranes. So found in CT layer, or the soft tissue area. So pathogen has breached and come into that area. They are designed to engulf the particle. So they create a vesicle. This will fuse with a lysosome. Gives you that phagolysosome. And that will enzymatically digest or break down the pathogen that it has in that vesicle that it took in. So disassembles or dismantles that pathogen. Now, the phagocytes that are involved in this process are neutrophils, which are a white blood cell that's in our largest concentration of our white blood cells, macrophage, which is a classical phagocyte that's always wandering around in our soft tissues, and then this dendritic cell. The dendritic cell is a very specialized phagocyte because it is designed to engulf the particle, digest the particle, break it up into bits and pieces, and then take it to our adaptive immune system. So the dendritic cell is a macrophage, but it is kind of like a scout, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So macrophages wandering through almost all body tissues. Used to be monocytes when they were in the bloodstream. And what's important about macrophages, they will live to fight another day. unlike neutrophils. Neutrophils, again, are white blood cells. They also form phagolysosomes. However, they will be killed in the process. They actually cannot break down the stuff well enough to actually survive that breakdown process. So they're killed in the process of actually defending you. However, because they're in such high concentrations, often the first to arrive. Another thing about neutrophils, they produce defensins. So remember, those are protein molecules that are like little knives, and they are basically stabbing the pathogen to death as best as they can. The dendritic cells, the phagocytes that are designed to interact with the immune system. So they'll take that pathogen in, they'll digest it, and then they will take it and use bits and pieces of it as an information system to transfer information to your immune system to start their process. Basophils and mast cells, full of pro-inflammatory chemicals. And remember, basos are in the blood. They can go into the soft tissues. But when you find mast cells, what's interesting, they look alike. Basophils and mast cells look alike, but they're actually different cells. So basos start in the blood, can then get into the soft tissues. Mast cells are only in the soft tissues, never found in the blood. And mostly you'll find mast cells in the connective tissue immediately below that protective epithelial layer. Both secrete heparin and histamine. So that's what we see with those dark granules. So they secrete heparin and histamine, and that will increase the fluid that's actually coming to the area of the infection. Increases fluid or exudate. I'll say invasion for right now. They also secrete chemotactic chemicals. These chemotactic chemicals are also designed to attract immune system cells to this area. Natural killer cells, they are just killers. So natural killer cells want to kill. You just don't want them to kill your cells, but they'd be happy to kill any cell that they came into contact with because they're just like a bunch of Navy SEALs hyped up on testosterone. They're just ready to kill. You know, so natural killer cells are interesting because they really do. That's why they're called natural killer cells. They want to just kill. And they love to kill cancer cells, cells that are infected with viruses, bacteria, which are actually cells themselves, and even transplant cells. So that's why natural killer cells have an additional negative side to them, because it's just like, oh, it's a killing party. You know, that's what they're into. And so you are always born, you always have a finite amount of natural killer cells circulating around at any time, because even if a normal cell looks at them crossways, they're going to get punched out. You know, it's just the way that's just the way they work. And anybody that knows about a Navy SEAL or any of these, any of our military that's really been doing a lot of aggressive male activity, they get that high testosterone level and they're ready to actually hurt anybody that gets in their way. So that's the thing about natural killer cells. They don't need to be told to do this. They just do it. It's kind of their own nature. So interestingly, though, they do require direct contact with the cell. And they use an interesting mechanism that we need to learn about. They use what's called a perforin granzyme mechanism. So they use perforins to penetrate, perforate. You know, when you perforate things, you make holes in it. So they use perforins to penetrate, make holes in the cell, then pour in granzymes. So granzymes are enzymes that once they get into the cell will cause cell destruction. And they cause cell destruction by a process called apoptosis. You guys remember the apoptosis? Apoptosis is basically the cell says, okay, now I'm going to commit suicide, I'm going to die. And this is how they prevent spread. So already you have in your body cells turning cancerous, but because you have a fully functioning natural killer cell armamentarium here, they're going out and they're already destroying them before those cancerous cells can actually multiply into enough numbers where you actually have a true cancerous process occurring. So natural killer cells are very important as our second line of defense. Eosinophils are another white blood cell, and remember, they are designed to target parasites, and their granules are lethal to parasites. So those red granules are lethal to our parasites, if we have any. So that's any invading organism, and this is a multicellular organism, and they dump their granules on the parasite to destroy it. So it degranulates. And so if you live in a country where parasitic infections are high, your eosinophil count will be high because our white blood cells will respond to any sort of pathological process going on in our body, and those cells that are designed to best combat those will actually increase in those numbers. The other problem, unfortunately, with us in our society, not so much that we have parasites to worry about, but for some reason eosinophil numbers increase in people with asthma and allergies. And now we're coming to inflammation. Inflammation is a very important response to injury, and we'll always have these, typically, almost always have these signs associated with them. We'll go into a little bit more for that inflammation area in just a moment. But when you have inflammation, you typically see redness, you typically feel heat, you typically also experience swelling of that tissue area and can actually experience pain. And so the redness is actually due to increased blood flow in the area. So we vasodilated. Vasodilated, more opened up the vessels, more blood flow. Increased heat is due to the same thing because we're bringing that nice warm blood and we're now pouring it into the tissue area itself. But then we also get swelling because we have increased vascular permeability. And so we're actually having fluids that are leaking out of the blood vessels, and they are containing various proteins and irons. And leaking out of the BVs, let's be a little bit more specific. What type of blood vessel are we actually leaking out of? Capillary, that's right. So we have various proteins that are going to be very important in helping us to actually fight this invasion, ions, and other chemicals. We'll talk about other chemicals later. Pain. Pain can come from the other chemicals. Pain can come from the microbial toxins that are actually being released into the area. And then also we have pain due to nociceptors or pressure receptors because we're distending the tissue, and whenever you have distension, acute distension is always uncomfortable. Yes?
Is that why something can throb, is increased pressure in the area?
Why some things throb? Yes, because you're actually feeling just like when you guys applied the blood pressure cuff. Remember the throbbing portion of that? So you're increasing pressure in that area, and the blood vessels that are trying to actually open up and give you the blood supply to that area, you can actually feel them trying to push blood into the area itself. So let's go up now to the inflammation area where we have tissue response to injury. The reason we have inflammation is to prevent spread. This is to keep the invasion localized. You want to prevent spread. It's already breached our surface barriers, and now it's in our soft tissue. We don't want it to actually start going away and branching on out into adjacent soft tissue areas or even get into the bloodstream. Also, with inflammation, we are going to be able to get in enough materials to actually start the eradication and disposal of the pathogen. And we're going to set the stage for repair. So inflammation, localizing things, bringing things into this local area to cause eradication of the pathogen, and then because this whole process, pathogen there as well as the process to get rid of the pathogen is going to cause tissue damage, we want to go ahead and now establish tissue repair in this process. So inflammation has actually a very positive aspect that we typically do not really want to hinder at all. Now, inflammatory chemicals released. Okay, so let's see here. Inflammation, we talked about the 4 signs, and so now let's take a look at the first step of inflammation, or in starting inflammation. In other words, we're going to have some chemicals that are going to be released, and these chemicals are there to actually bring in that increased blood flow as well as leakiness. So the chemicals released, I don't know why I have, oh, the vasodilator chemicals, yes. So these are vasodilator chemicals plus more. Histamine is a vasodilator. Prostaglandins are vasodilators, and kinins are vasodilators. So histamine, prostaglandins, and kinins are also all going to vasodilate, which means bring increased blood flow to the area. The problem, though, is that with prostaglandins and kinins, they actually are also nociceptor chemicals. So they are going to turn on pain receptors. And so we have prostaglandins coming into the area, increasing the blood flow to the tissue, but they also cause you to experience pain when that actually occurs. Kinins also increase blood flow to the tissue, but also will cause you to experience pain because of the chemical that's actually released. And in addition to that, because we're having vasodilation, we're going to also then bring about increased capillary permeability, which means we're going to make our capillaries more leaky. And the stuff that's going to be leaking out is the fluid component of our blood, not necessarily the cellular. The cellular component can already, remember, get out into the soft tissue because of that diapedesis, so they actually can squeeze through the capillaries without them being leaky. But the leakier you make them, the easier it is going to be for them to actually squeeze out of the capillaries into the soft tissues, which is actually really good for you. So inflammatory chemicals giving us vasodilation, and then we're going to get increased capillary permeability because of these chemicals, and we're going to get a condition called hyperemia. So increased blood flow as well as fluid in the soft tissues. So increased interstitial fluid in our soft tissues. And that gives us a term called hyperemia. The area is hyper over emia, congested with blood. Fluid leaking out into the soft tissue is actually called an exudate. Exudes. So something exudes, we're getting this fluid flow actually occurring. If we would like to actually minimize this hyperemia, we can actually ingest chemicals that will actually help with taking down the increased blood flow and therefore the increased swelling. What's a chemical you can take that will combat some of these guys up here? Cause an opposite effect. Antihistamine. So fluid leaking out is causing the hyperemia, congestion with blood, and also increased fluid in the soft tissues. And we want to slow that down or minimize it because it's uncomfortable. We can take an antihistamine. To combat because it works against histamine. There's also other chemicals you can take to also help with inflammation. They're typically called anti-inflammatories or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And also my favorite one is aspirin, ASA. That's the abbreviation, the medical abbreviation for aspirin. Aspirin is an antiprostaglandin. And so what's nice about aspirin, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs also do this, but all of the other NSAIDs, the one that they have to live up to is aspirin. So aspirin is the best, and then the others are just modifications to help minimize stomach damage and platelet-related issues because aspirin is also anti-platelet. So NSAIDs are not anti-platelet, but for the most part, but aspirins are. But it is a chief antiprostaglandin that is very effective against our prostaglandins. So it will decrease vasodilation and decrease pain for you. So it's a very potent antiprostaglandin. So we've got hot swollen tissue that is now ripe for the next phase, which is, so we got increased blood flow, we got increased leakiness, and we've got now cells coming into the area. So increased blood flow, increased leakiness, now phagocyte mobilization. So leukocytosis. That means that we're having an increase in our white blood cell count. That's what leukocytosis means, increase in white blood cells. And that is because injured cells will release chemicals that increase neutrophil numbers. So injured cells release chemicals that increase neutrophils. And neutrophils are very happy to go in there, and that's why when you have a sliver or something that's kind of penetrated into the soft tissues, you get a little bit of pus around it. That little bit of pus around it's a bunch of dead neutrophils as well as some of the cells that were actually in the soft tissue itself. We're increasing our neutrophil count. We're increasing their ability to actually attach to the walls of the capillaries in the area that is adjacent to the infected tissue. So that's where margination comes in. Diapedesis, white blood cells squeezing out into the interstitial areas. Chemotaxis, the damaged cells are releasing various chemicals, as well as other chemicals being released by other cells coming into the area. And these chemicals are designed to attract neutrophils and macrophages because we want to get rid of the offending pathogen. They move through the soft tissues with an amoeboid type of fashion because they're now in the soft tissues. Once you're in the bloodstream, you're rolling along with the bloodstream, but amoeboid movement means that you're in CT. The other thing that we're doing is we are delivering plasma proteins. Do you guys remember the main plasma protein of blood? Albumin. So albumin is the main plasma protein of blood, but it's not the only plasma protein because we talked about clotting factors. Clotting factors are all plasma proteins, but they're just not as in high numbers as albumin is, but they're always there. Now we have some other plasma proteins that are going to help us limit the spread of the pathogen, and clotting proteins are actually one of those. So remember, clotting proteins are in the serum. We also will have complement, which is a protein that is designed to actually get rid of bacteria, and antibodies. Antibodies are plasma proteins floating around in your bloodstream that have been produced by your B cells of the adaptive immune system. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So inflammation, we're going to increase our vascular permeability. We're going to release inflammatory chemicals that will increase also we're increasing blood flow first, we're increasing vascular permeability second, and then we're bringing in the cells to help fight the problem, number 3. And then we're also having plasma proteins coming in with the leaky fluid. Sorry about that, guys. Antimicrobial proteins that are found in our system to help us fight off various offending agents, no matter what they are interferons, and I'm going to talk more about complement. But I want to talk about interferons first. I'm missing a picture here. Oh well. Interferons, small proteins that help fight viruses. What happens is the virally infected cells produce interferons, abbreviated IF, which are proteins, and they release these into the interstitial area around the cell. These proteins, these interferon proteins, are then taken up by the surrounding cells. And then the surrounding cells, when the virus tries to infect them, can now block viral replication. So I'll say viral activity in that cell. So the cell that produced interferon dies, but the cells that take up interferon survive. And that's what this little cartoon is actually meant to show. It's meant to show here is an infected cell, here it is producing a bunch of interferon, and now the interferon is taken up by the normal cells, and we can't get any sort of viral replication to occur in that cell. And that's what viruses want to do. Viruses want to invade, replicate, destroy the cell, and then invade, replicate, destroy the cell, and so on and so forth. The other branch shows that there's some interferon that's actually making our natural killer cells even more ready to fight. And so they even hype up the already aggressive natural killer cells to actually find cells to treat with perforin and the granzymes to cause their apoptosis. So interferon is a plasma protein, or is a protein produced by cells that are infected with the virus. Now, complement is another protein and is always circulating around in your bloodstream in an inactive state, kind of like clotting factors. Clotting factors circulate around in your blood in an inactive state. Complement circulates around in your bloodstream in an inactive state. Both are proteins. Both come from the liver. And in complement, we have over 30 different players in this complement system. It is our major foreign cellular control mechanism. And it is antimicrobial. Which means it's against bacteria, for the most part. Also, I'm going to add bad tissue, because it also acts against tissues that have undergone transplantation. It is, they are produced by the liver in the inactive form, and also are inflammatory when activated. We have a couple of ways to activate complement. One is the classical pathway and the other is the alternate pathway. The classical pathway was discovered first. And the alternate pathway was discovered later, and the alternate is actually more of the innate or nonspecific mechanism. So alternate is more related to the innate system. The classical pathway is involved with our immune system because it requires that thing there, an antibody. And so they called it complement because it complements both systems. It's actually involved in both systems. So complement is involved in innate and complement is involved in our adaptive immunity. That's actually occurs. But classical was discovered first and requires antibody. The antibody has to be bound to this pathogen, and so I'm going to make a blob there, and it's a bacteria. And I'm going to show you what antibody is generally, what it looks like. It looks like a Y. And so antibody looks like a Y, and now it's bound to the pathogen, and it will cause the complement to actually now come and form MAC, M-A-C, MAC is the complement that actually forms a hole on our bacterium and cause the lysis of the bacterium itself. So binds MAC faster than the actual alternate mechanism. And cell lysis. In the alternate mechanism, which is more related to our innate system, these complement proteins will actually interact with surface polysaccharides, and surface polysaccharides are sugars. So bacteria have these little sugar coatings to them, I guess, to make them sweeter to the system. And complement can actually recognize those and create an actual MAC attack complex on that, or even cause opsonization. But these two up here, these activation for the two pathways, let's go ahead and make sure this is activating our MAC pathway via the alternate or the classical, and that is for this circular formation of a donut ring that bores into the bacterium and then causes actually lysis because of water now has a free way to enter in and explode it. Other things that complement does is it causes opsonization. It increases inflammation and causes cytolysis. I'll write down the notes on this for later, but let's take a look at opsonization cartoon down below. So the pathogen is the brown thing, and with a little teal bubbles all over it. The complement is actually attaching to that pathogen and making it more attractive for macrophages to actually engulf. So opsonization is a process where we enhance the attractiveness of the pathogen to macrophages. They're more excited to actually engulf them. Inflammation. Well, inflammation is a complement factor where it will bring in also, the more complement we have in an area will cause chemotaxis, cause more cells to come into that area. And then cytolysis is all due to the MAC complex. And so we have our pathogen, which has its own surface polysaccharides, that's what the blue dots are, that the complement recognizes and then bores holes in it and causes the lysis of the cell. We'll stop there and do a couple of clickers, and, well, a clicker, and then you guys are out of here.